Barakatah Yahweh, Barakatah Yahweh Bahasham, Barakahak Wadash, Barakathum. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, glory, and infinite honors to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone who ruled and teach well. In peace and salutations to you, sincere Akim out there, pushing this word in truth and sincerity to the four corners of the globe. May you brothers endure unto the end. This is the brother Ra'aya coming at you with another lesson, and I'll be profiling a segment of this video from Conversation Among the Ruins' YouTube channel titled, How Did We Get Here? America's Dangerous Descent Explained. But where I'm going to start at in this video is going into how the Europeans, in Western Europe, the EU is nothing more than vassals for the United States of America. And, this is all, a part of biblical prophecy that, these European Edomites, or so-called white people, would give, the leadership role over to the United States of America for a time. But there's a flip side to that coin. There's going to come a point during World War III where America's European allies are going to turn against her and ally themselves with America's enemies, like Russia primarily and China. And it's going to culminate in all of them shooting nuclear missiles onto the United States of America. Which, before we start, I'm going to go to Revelation chapter 17, start at verse 11. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth, and is of the seven, and goeth into perdition. And this beast that is the eighth and of the seven is speaking of the United States of America. And the other seven, the seven heads, include Esau's, major rulerships throughout history, which includes Greece, Rome, Germania Major, Germania Minor, Spain, France, Britain, which is the seventh, and then America, which is the eighth and is of the seven, because the United States came out of Great Britain. Verse 12, and the 10 horns which thou sawest, and this is referring to the EU, or the European Union, which is the, economic aspect of the last leg of the fourth beast in Daniel chapter 2, those iron toes mixed with miry clay. And the beast that these 10 horns are on is speaking of NATO, the military aspect. And the 10 horns, the EU, which thou sawest, are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast, the eighth that is of the seven, the United States of America, which again, when we get back into that clip, the two speakers on that channel are just going to keep going in on how the EU and these Western European Edomites are nothing more than vassals being abused by the United States of America. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. And as it said in verse 12, they shall receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. And this isn't talking about a literal hour. At 6 p.m. on a Tuesday, they said, look, America, we want some power with you until 7 p.m. that Tuesday. Just like it says in the scriptures, 1,000 years or as a day to the Lord, this is on a different type of timetable. And, as we're seeing these end times prophecies, begin to take place in the fracturing of Esau's rulership, we can see that this hour is just about up. And, this hour, began around the time after World War II, when the United States of America became a superpower, and you saw the forming of the EU as well as NATO, which we'll get that real quick. This is on wikipedia.org, the Treaty of Rome, how spiritual, because those iron toes mixed with miry clay, this NATO EU system, which the US is at the head of, is Rome reincarnated. The Treaty of Rome, or EEC Treaty, officially the treaty establishing the European Economic Community, which was what the EU was known as before it became known as the EU, and included, those first 10 European nations of it, the beginnings of the 10 horns, though you've got about 27 members now, brought about the creation of the European Economic Community, EEC, the best known of the European communities, EC. The treaty was signed on 25th March 1957 by Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany, which is just Germany proper today, which are all, part of the 10 horns. And it came into force on the 1st of January 1958. Originally, the treaty establishing the European Economic Community, and now continuing under the name Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, it remains one of the two most important treaties in what is now the European Union. And when we click on the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, it says, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, TFEU, is one of two treaties forming the constitutional basis of the European Union, the other being the Treaty on European Union. It was previously known as the Treaty Establishing European Community. And, you got the European Union flag there, which this flag has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, which, originally it used to be 10 stars, but, Esau understands the scriptures, so he does what he can to try to, change up prophecy and upset it, which is all futile at the end of the day, because these things continue to come to pass. But when was NATO formed? The beast that those 10 horns are upon. April 4th, 1949, in Washington, D.C. Follow the birth of NATO as we know it today. A transatlantic agreement signed on 4th April 1949, which created an alliance of countries united against any form of military aggression. And, while the U.S. is not a part of the EU, it is, a founding member of NATO. And again, as we're going to see in that clip, the NATO and the EU are nothing more than vassals to the United States of America. Going back to Revelation 12, Revelation 17, verses 12 to 13. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings, 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. So I'm going to start this clip at the 11-minute and 23-second mark, and this is a fair use copyright disclaimer. I do not own any of the footage in this clip, nor do I stand to gain from it monetarily. It is simply for educational purposes.
But I'm wondering, at some point, the Europeans will have to break. That's like the strongest, bastion of U.S. empire. Is Western Europe. They are completely vassal status to the United States. It's kind of gross watching.
Yeah, it is. It's painful. I mean, these once proud nations. Right. Like there seemed to be when Trump, first began to talk about maybe, pulling out of Ukraine and just leaving it to the Europeans, and back there in the spring, there was some sort of brave talk about we're going to do it ourselves or whatever. And then it's clear at some point after about a month or two of that they decided maybe that's not the approach. We just have to start licking his boots. And that's what we've seen ever since. It's just, you're just so wonderful. Yes. Please, thank you for these crumbs that you've given us. And, thank you for not punishing us too much, imposing such heavy tariffs on us. We're so grateful to you, great leader. That's where they've been, and that's clearly the approach that they've decided to take, and it's again painful to watch.
Well, I mean, we've already seen, Russia. I mean, Europe cut itself off from Russian energy. The Nord Stream pipeline being broke up, and now all that energy that was supposed to be sent to Europe is now being diverted to China via the new Power of Siberia 2 pipeline that they're building.
Well, that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah,
it'll be some years, but it will be
construction, right? But the energy will be flowing
from the same gas field in.
A few years ago, I put out this video.
What the f is in your mug?
And immediately it started racking up millions of views. Why? Probably something to do with the thousands.
Northwestern Siberia.
Right. So Europe willingly cut itself off much of its lifeblood for its manufacturing from Russia, just that energy. And now I'm wondering, there's going to be pressure. Are they going to be willing to do the same to China? Because we're already seeing pressure that they want the Europeans to sanction or put tariffs on them and, put pressure on China as well. And you're just wondering, Europe was damaged so much from cutting themselves off with Russia. If they cut themselves off from China, then it's like you're completely dependent on the United States now. And the U.S. is just going to use and abuse you, and then you're going to be left with nothing.
Yeah.
And so do you think they will go that
Hey, and these 10 horns represent 10 kings who have no power, but 1 hour have received power with the beast, given their power over to the beast. As we can see, that eighth beast just continues to use them and abuse them like a side hoe. Which brings us to Daniel chapter 7 verse 19. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, speaking of those legs of iron, the ancient pagan Edomite Roman Empire, which was diverse from all the others because, it had a Senate house and political parties and a consul and a proconsul, which was like, president and vice president, similar to, Western democracy, even though, America's a republic. Exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron and his nails of brass, which devoured, break in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. Verse 20, and of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up. Now we're getting into, the reincarnated Roman Empire, beginning with Esau coming back into power during the Renaissance, or the rebirth of that Roman way back into the world. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, speaking of America, and before whom 3 fell. And those 3 that fell is speaking of France, Britain, and Spain, who were the major players in the New World, who all had friction with America before, the 13 colonies eventually took over, this landmass, and it's the United States of America as you know it today. Even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. And when we get that word stout, it's H7229, Ra'ab, which in the outline of biblical usage says great, figurative power great, captain, chief. Chief, great, Lord, master, which is conversations amongst the runes just said, with the EU cutting off, major nations that they have significant economic ties with, that would just further leave them at the mercy of the United States of America for America to treat them any way they want, whose look was more stout than his fellows. And every time the Europeans have followed after the U.S., whether in economic sanctions or tariffs or these wars in Western Asia or, the Middle East and North Africa, who always received the blowback from it? Who received the refugee crises from those wars? Who saw their energy prices go up and a lot of, significant natural resources, gas and oil that they received being cut off? These Western European nations.
How far do you think there will be a break?
Well, they've gone a good ways down that road. I mean, so far they have complied with U.S. demands, for sanctions or higher tariffs, like on the electric vehicles, and then very recently, of course, there was essentially the seizure of that Chinese company in the Netherlands. And they did it, later. The news came out, which is not at all surprising, that it was done at the behest of the U.S.
Whose look was more stout, the master, the Lord, than his fellows.
Again, and then China immediately responded. This company, it was there in the Netherlands, and it was essentially a subsidiary of a Chinese company, a larger Chinese company. And so the larger Chinese company declared that they would cease to support this company, which really makes it, perhaps will render it unprofitable. So they're going to end up with a company that's not even viable. Another loss for Europe. But this is where they're going, and they don't show any signs of really changing. I guess they showed some resistance. Again, they wanted the U.S. to go ahead with 100% tariffs on China. But Trump, you could say, essentially called their bluff and said, yeah, we'll do that if you go first. And they didn't, they're reluctant. Now there's a question, though. I mean, there's something that Trump came up with recently, that he said, or at least this is reported, that he is going to propose, like, using the tariffs on China, the revenues that are raised through those tariffs, to fund the Ukraine war.
And, I thought those all this money being raised from these tariffs are going to be used to make America great again. My ass.
That could be something that the Europeans would go for. But the Europeans apparently would have to go along with and impose their own tariffs on China.
Why would they take such a risk? Don't they understand how damaging that is? What are they so afraid of? Or why are they afraid if the U.S. empire collapse? I know they're they're supposedly the beneficiaries, but they're being forced to be in this, NATO, how much protection is it really offering them? And they're forced to spend now, they're trying to push up to 5% of their GDP to buy overpriced weapons that we don't have enough of, that don't work very well, instead of,
Oh, no.
What's the argument?
It's very, sorry.
It's because it's biblical prophecy. For that 1 hour, they would give their power over to America. But, hey, that hour's almost up, so they're going to turn against them.
Very sorry spectacle. It's just the current crop of European leaders are just...
Man boobs, let me show you how to get rid of them. Every morning, do 30 of these, 30 of these, and 30 of these.
Seem to have, unable to actually think beyond vassalship to the U.S., that they have become, mentally, they have become vassals of the U.S. And I think it's the result of a long process, and a deliberate effort, actually, on part of the U.S. to cultivate people that were just devoted to U.S. leadership. And it seems to have succeeded. Again, it was not even too long ago. Even if we go like 10 years in the past, we had people like Merkel that were kind of transition figures. They were halfway there, but they still showed some sort of independence. Like, for example, she did support Nord Stream in spite of U.S. pressure. And then you go another 10 years or so in past, and you found people that were really independent. Again, we had the French president, I guess, was it Mitterrand at that time? I hope I remember that correctly, who opposed the invasion of Iraq, quite openly. But now you're just not going to find that. It's just whatever the U.S. chooses to do. All these leaders have been replaced with neocons that look to U.S. hegemony, and it's been a process of kind of mental subordination, you could say. It's hard to explain how it could have happened, but it's happened. That's what we have.
I mean, I think it's quite pervasive just amongst European people in general. I talked to, a few of my friends. I have one buddy that lives in Brussels, and he was saying that, just, when it comes to Russia, it's like everybody is all on the same page. Maybe he's in Brussels, probably the belly of the beast there. But yeah, there's also, I remember something. I have a good friend in Norway, and I remember talking to him a long time ago, and he was saying that, like, well, we love America because we'd much rather be ruled by America than by China. And I just thought that was such a weird thing to say. I was like, what do you mean? How about you don't be ruled by anybody? You're Norway. You're way up here. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like this. But there was that, just sort of that mentality. It's like, well, if it's not the Americans, they're more similar to us. I like their movies and their comedies. It's fun. Yeah. I don't like the Chinese, so we better stick with it. Like that's almost, I think, sometimes the mindset people have. Like, well, if it's not the Americans, it's not great.
I best believe there's a heavy racial component to it too. I remember about 10 years ago, I knew this French girl, this Edomite girl from France. She had the accent and everything. She was over here on one of those student programs, and we got to talking, and she was just explaining her disgust at so-called Chinese people, which are the biblical Moabites, saying how they were dirty. And she said this is her words, they were like cockroaches.
With the Americans, but it'd be way worse under the Russians or under the Chinese. Europe has this mentality that they have to be under somebody. At least I think it is pervasive, not just within the elite. It's just, and I wonder, is that just an effect of post World War II, or is that just a product of European, feudalism and vassal statehood?
It's a product of prophecy.
The way that our civilization developed, which is just a lot different than the way that Chinese civilization developed, for example.
Right. Well, again, for decades, Europe was entirely dependent on the U.S. for its security, through the Cold War. That NATO actually served a purpose. And you can say that this is a consequence of this, but it's still, I don't think it really explains. Maybe, this is a root of the problem, that, again, there was, at least among certain Europeans, this, there was this tendency developed, more than a tendency. It just became a reflex. It became, for them, just axiomatic that, okay, we simply have to follow the U.S., for our, we're dependent on them. Without them, somebody else is going to rule over us. And again, like if you're going back to the 1960s or 1970s, that wasn't such a ridiculous thought. Maybe if the Soviet, if war broke out, the Soviet Union could really have the ability, if the Americans were not there, to occupy all of Europe and to impose their will as they had imposed on the Warsaw Pact. But those years are long gone, and you would think, when with the fall of the Soviet Union, beginning with Gorbachev and his appeal to a common European home, that there would have been a response to that. And the rise of the EU was actually a chance to establish kind of a European independence. Now we have our chance. Now it's over. We had those years of the Cold War. That has come to an end. Now Europe can actually become, stand on its own 2 feet. But that's not what we've seen, and I find it difficult to explain. I know.
Well, in this clip on that point, but hey, with all these other end time signs looming, World War III on the horizon, the mark of the BEAST in Revelation 13 verses 16 to 18, which is the micro C-hip implant looming. More and more nations are talking about implementing a national digital ID, civil unrest, martial law, all these things. That just lets us know that this hour where those 10 kings and those 10 horns gave their power over to the 8th beast is almost up. Now let's go to Daniel chapter 2. I'm going to start at verse 40. And this is that vision that King Nebuchadnezzar saw in a dream of a statue of a man made of different metals, which represented all the heathen kingdoms that would rule before the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of Israel, where you so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans would be ruling for eternity in, would be established. But now I'm going to jump down to the legs of iron, which, as the header says, Rome. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And now we're going into the last leg of the fourth beast, those iron toes mixed with miry clay, the NATO EU system that the U.S. is at the head of. Remember, the Treaty of Rome back in 1958. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, and that clay on the one hand can go into the EU, the economic aspect, which when you go to Habakkuk chapter 2, that thick clay, that abatya, when you go into the Strongs, is speaking of debts or heavy pledges, which, you got several nations in the EU in a recession with debts and inflation, much like the United States of America. And that iron, the military aspect, that beast, NATO. And then it can also go into the weaker nations like the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, and the stronger nations like your United States, Britain's, France, and Germany. The kingdom shall be divided. And remember what Yahushua, the Son of the Most High, whom the world ignorantly refers to as so-called Jesus, said in Mark chapter 3, verses 24 to 25. And if a kingdom be divided, that kingdom cannot stand. The kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And we're coming into the point to where it's going to be completely broken. And like I said at the beginning of the video, America's Western European allies are going to turn against her and ally themselves with nations like Russia and China and shoot those nukes onto her. This is the book of Obadiah. I'm going to jump to verse 7, but, this whole book is, as the header says, Edom will be humbled, is dedicated to the judgment and the downfall of you Edomites, you so-called white people. All the men of thy confederacy, or your allies, have brought thee to the border, the men that were at peace with thee, such as these EU and NATO nations, as they've been going into in that video. The Europeans are nothing more than vassals to America. When are they going to snap out of it? The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. And more towards the eastern part of Europe, within the EU and NATO, you got a lot of those nations, really calling things out and being like, look, by us trying to cut off ties with Russia, that's really going to affect us, more than we realize. And then even with some of these, the Western European nations, they've got something called ghost ships, where even though they're putting sanctions and stuff like that in public on Russian oil and natural gas, you have a third party like India buying that Russian oil, putting it on those ghost ships, and then selling it to Europe like it's Indian oil. So they're already deceiving them and prevailed against thee. Eventually, it's going to go nuclear. They that eat thy bread, getting overpriced United States, LNG, light natural gas, and these overpriced weapons right now have laid a wound under thee. They're going to turn those very same things against you. There is none understanding in him. But now let's go back to Revelation chapter 17. We're going to jump down to verse 16. And the 10 horns, the EU, which thou sawest upon the beast, NATO, these shall hate the whore. And when you go to the first couple of verses of this chapter, it speaks of that whore being mystery Babylon, Babylon the Great, which is the United States of America. These shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire from those nuclear missiles. Hey, the men there of thy confederacy have, turned against thee. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and laid that wound under thee. But that's it with this video. With this video, I hope you sincere, Akim and Akwath were edified. Just keep strong. We are almost out of this final wicked captivity of the heathen nations, chiefly of the Edomites. And as always, I'm going to say Abad Babol, Kwam Yasharallah, and until next time, Shalom.